They called it Imperium sine fine, an empire without end. But beneath Rome's polished marble and immortal legends lies a record carved not in glory, but in blood. This was no mere nation. It was a machine of conquest, fed by fire, iron, and fear. Where Rome advanced, resistance was not subdued, it was annihilated. Whole cultures vanished beneath its legions, their names erased, their cities scorched from memory. Its dominion reshaped the world, but at a cost few dared to reckon with. What we remember as civilization, others lived as devastation, and history has not forgotten. Crucifixion as state terror. To defy Rome was not only to risk death, it was to invite a death that would serve as a lesson to thousands. Crucifixion was not merely execution, it was political theatre. This form of punishment, known to the Romans as crux, stood as a towering warning. To rebel was to be broken slowly, publicly, and without mercy. Used primarily against slaves, rebels, and the lowest ranks of society, crucifixion became a calculated instrument of fear during Rome's expansion. The message was clear. Submission meant survival. Resistance meant obliteration. During the Third Servile War, the infamous rebellion led by Spartacus, Rome made an example so horrifying it echoes through the centuries. After finally crushing the slave army in 71 BCE, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered the crucifixion of over 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, the very road that led into the capital. Their bodies lined the highway for over 100 miles, a grim procession of Rome's absolute dominance. The Roman historian Appian records that Crassus crucified them along the Appian Way, turning the road into a chilling warning against future uprisings. And it worked. No slave rebellion ever again reached the scale of Spartacus's revolt. But this punishment was not reserved only for Rome's enslaved. Any provincial uprising, Judea, Gaul, Britannia, could end with mass crucifixions carried out not as justice, but as spectacle. Posts were left upright in conquered cities, sometimes for months, as silent threats. Crucifixion was not just an act of cruelty, it was imperial policy. Pain became propaganda. And in this, Rome perfected a kind of psychological warfare that no conquered people could ignore, erasing Carthage from history. Few acts of Roman aggression embody such cold finality as the destruction of Carthage. This was not simply a victory, it was the obliteration of a rival civilization. Known as Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. This phrase echoed through the Roman Senate, most famously uttered by the statesman Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with it, regardless of topic. His call became a prophecy fulfilled in 146 BCE at the end of the Third Punic War. Carthage, once a dominant maritime power and the only force in the Western Mediterranean to rival Rome, had already been beaten in 2 earlier wars. But it was not enough. Rome sought more than triumph. It wanted assurance that Carthage would never rise again. And so, under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, Rome laid siege to the city for over 2 years. When Carthage finally fell, the result was a complete razing. Ancient sources such as Appian report that the city burned for over a week. Its inhabitants, men, women and children, were either taken as slaves or killed. The city itself was dismantled, stone by stone. Much has been debated about the tale that Roman soldiers sowed salt into the land to curse it with infertility. Modern scholars often consider this apocryphal, but the symbolism remains. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, it buried it, metaphorically and literally, under the weight of its own supremacy. In this act, we see a chilling principle of Roman warfare. Some enemies were not to be subdued, but to be forgotten. Rome would not share the world, it would consume it, wiping out entire cities in Gaul. When Julius Caesar turned his gaze northward toward Gaul in the mid-1st century BCE, It was not merely conquest he sought, it was transformation. Gaul, known to the Romans as a land of fiercely independent tribes, became the proving ground for one of the most ruthless campaigns in Roman military history. Over the course of nearly a decade, Caesar led his legions in a brutal expansion that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. And some cities, quite simply, ceased to exist. Perhaps the most notorious example is the siege of Avaricum in 52 BCE. The city, located in what is now central France, resisted Roman control during the wider Gallic revolt led by the chieftain Vercingetorix. Caesar, whose Commentarii de Bello Gallico remains our primary source, described Avaricum as the most beautiful city in all Gaul. But beauty offered no protection. After a prolonged siege, the Roman legions breached the defences, and what followed was systematic destruction. Caesar himself records that nearly the entire population of around 40,000 was put to the sword, sparing almost none. This was not an isolated incident. The Gallic Wars were marked by similar fates befalling towns that resisted too strongly or too long. Cities such as Cenabum, Noviodunum, and Uxellodunum were either burned to the ground, depopulated, or enslaved wholesale. Caesar deliberately implemented a policy of terror to crush revolts in Gaul. At Uxellodunum, he wrote that he cut off the hands of surrendering warriors to make them a living warning. These acts were not excesses of war, they were deliberate demonstrations of Roman resolve. By erasing entire urban centres, Caesar ensured that rebellion would not merely be punished, it would be rendered unthinkable. In Gaul, Rome was not just building an empire, it was stamping out alternatives to its rule, one city at a time. Forced starvation in Roman siege warfare. Starvation was not an unfortunate byproduct of Roman siege warfare, it was a calculated strategy. In the Republic and imperial eras alike, Roman commanders turned hunger into a weapon as effective as the sword. When a city defied Roman demands, it was not always assaulted immediately. Instead, it was often sealed off, its supply lines severed, and its people left to endure the slow, crushing pressure of famine. This tactic was codified in Roman military thinking. Denying access to food and water wore down both morale and physical resistance, making conquest less costly for Roman forces. The ancient historian Frontinus, in his Stratagems, described this as a wise economy of blood, a way to subdue without exhausting Roman strength. One of the most harrowing examples comes from the siege of Numantia in Hispania, between 134 and 133 BCE. The Numantines, a small but fiercely defiant Celtiberian people, refused to submit. In response, Scipio Aemilianus, the same general who had destroyed Carthage, encircled the city with a massive wall, cutting off all external resources. Inside, conditions deteriorated quickly. No reinforcements came, no food remained. The citizens, driven to desperation, ultimately chose self-destruction over surrender. Ancient sources describe mass suicides and fires set by the inhabitants themselves rather than falling into Roman hands. In Judea, too, during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the same method was employed. Roman forces under Titus encircled the city, and within weeks, starvation gripped the population. Josephus, a contemporary historian, recorded the suffering with restrained sorrow, noting that those who died were beyond counting. Rome's siege tactics were not just military, they were psychological. The message was simple. Resistance would not only bring the sword, but the slow erosion of life itself. Hunger became a policy, and waiting became its executioner. Mass enslavement after conquest. In the Roman worldview, conquest was not complete until the defeated had been made profitable. Enslavement on a massive scale was not merely a consequence of Roman victory, it was a core feature of it. Cities that resisted Rome too strongly or held out too long were often emptied of their populations. The inhabitants sold into slavery to finance future campaigns and reward the legions. It was systemic, organized, and utterly devastating for those on the receiving end. The Roman Republic and later the Empire built one of the largest slave economies in history. Conquests across Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean provided a near-constant stream of captives. After the sack of Epirus in 167 BCE, the general Aemilius Paulus ordered the enslavement of 150,000 people. This was not an isolated act of cruelty, it was state-sanctioned economic policy. Plutarch records that the sacking of Epirus in 167 BCE yielded such immense plunder that, along with other eastern conquests, Rome suspended direct taxes on citizens for decades, a policy that lasted until the chaos of the late Republic forced its reversal. Slavery touched nearly every aspect of Roman society. Enslaved people were used in agriculture, mines, households, and even within administrative offices. But those taken in mass after war were often treated as expendable. The historian Livy writes of entire towns in Liguria and Gaul that were emptied of inhabitants after surrender or defeat, their people marched off in chains as living commodities. One of the most infamous examples was after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Josephus tells us that over 90,000 were enslaved, many sent to labor camps or paraded in the triumph of the Emperor Vespasian. Others, especially the young and strong, were sold in foreign markets. To Rome, enslaved peoples were both punishment and prize. Their suffering built temples, homes and roads, foundations of a civilization that often forgot the cost. Rome's empire was built not only with law and architecture, but with brutality, subjugation and silence, enforced through fear. These were not isolated horrors. They were systemic instruments of power that reshaped entire civilizations and erased others from history. Their echoes endure, not just in ruins or records, but in the very structure of empire itself. How do we measure a civilization's greatness? By what it built,